creators, and welcome to another Disability Dramaturgy Deep Dive. I'm so glad to have you. If you're new here, hi! I'm Sydney. I'm a little sleep deprived. My pronouns are they, them. I make videos about disability or disability adjacent stuff in science, history, education, media, whatever. In this series, we break down shows that either implicitly or explicitly involve disability to academically demonstrate that disabled stories have always been a part of the media canon and always will be, work on our critical thinking and media analysis skills, and talk about ways to more ethically stage and talk about these shows, always with a cool, that happened, now what mindset that doesn't point fingers but instead lovingly pushes the industry forward and unpacks the fundamentally flawed system upon which it was built. It's a really great time, especially when I get to tie into currently existing productions, which in this case I do, hence why we're rushing this video out and I'm very sleepy. As always, I have a playlist of all of the other theater deep dives I've done that I will link in the description below for you if you want to check those out. While you're there, you can also find the source list for this video, the link to my Patreon if you want to support me and get early access to what I am up to, and I think the like and subscribe buttons also exist down there along with the comment section, so do with that what you will. And for friends who need it. Sorry, last thing. I'm a white young person with light brown shoulder length, longer than shoulder length curly hair. I'm wearing a white t-shirt with a navy green is not a color, with a dark green button-up open on top. I couldn't do cosplay today, I'm so sorry. And I'm sitting in front of a plain wall that has green leaves on it. And content warnings, this particular show does involve themes of assault and murder, and also there is a Luke and Leia moment, if you know what I mean. So proceed with caution, but it is a comedy, so trust me on this one, we'll get there. I get the vibe this is one of those shows that everybody's heard of but very few people actually know a lot about, so it's been a delight to watch other people also experience this in real time over the last week. Before Batboy the Musical came Batboy himself, a Batboy creature created by Weekly World News, a satirical tabloid that was in print from 1979 to 2007 and is now digital, that was, or I guess is, pretty much entirely made up stories that usually involve the paranormal and the supernatural. It has like the energy of The Onion to some extent, it just has more creatures and it's just a little more out there. Batboy made his debut on the cover of the June 23rd, 1992 issue, I'll put a photo of it on the screen, with a story about how a mysterious bat child was discovered in a West Virginia cave. It was the second best-selling issue of the tabloid in its history, and so Batboy became a sort of mascot for them. They launched an Adventures of Batboy cartoon, and he appeared in many subsequent issues as major stories. He was known for being very skittish and elusive, constantly escaping and then being found in various places, and over the course of his life he has helped find Osama bin Laden, he's been jailed in Argentina via tranquilizer dart, he's been captured by the FBI and locked in a government medical lab, he's gone on tour, he's gotten knighted by the Queen, he's converted to Judaism, he's led a car chase, he's run for president, he's auditioned for American Idol. He's had quite the life. He's also pretty impressive given the quality of Photoshop at the time. If you're ever bored, go read some of the Weekly World News Batboy lore. It's delightful. Now because of this creature developed a sort of cult following. There's also supposedly a live-action Batboy in the works for Netflix at the moment. We'll see what that turns out to be, but the most famous thing to come out of Batboy outside of his original cult following is the musical with book by Keith Farley and Brian Fleming and music and lyrics by Lawrence O'Keefe, who you may know as the composer for Heathers and Legally Blonde the musical. And the show began its life at the Actors Gang in LA in 1997, premiering on October 31st and running until December 7th. And this specific group is important for the development of the show because the Actors Gang is an experimental theater group that created a performance method called the Style, which can be best described as a performance method derived from Comédie de l'Arte, from the work of the Théâtre du Soleil in Paris, from vaudeville, from the political agitprop theater of the 1930s, and from the off-Broadway movement of the 1960s, particularly the work of the Playhouse of the Ridiculous. The style is artificial and presentational, yet insists on deep truthfulness and high emotional stakes. Unlike musicals in which the goal is to be as silly as possible, the producers Spamalot, Dirty Rotten Scoundrels, with Batboy the goal is to be as serious as possible within the context of an utterly silly universe. This gave Batboy a very unique tone where it's not full camp, but rather grounded within its campiness, which I think is part of why it gained such a fan base. Because it's weird and it's funny, but it also tugs on your heartstrings at the same time. After its run there, they had several stage readings, constantly tweaking the piece, followed by a 2001 run off-Broadway at the Union Square Theater, opening on March 21st of that year. If you're like me and you're curious about theaters, the Union Square Theater did close in 2016. The production had Devon May in the role of Batboy and a young Carrie Butler as Shelley Parker. Carrie is now playing Shelley's mother in the City Center production, which is just delightful. It was directed by Scott Schwartz, music directed by Alex Lacamoire, oh he keeps appearing in these, and choreographed by Christopher Gattelli, who also keeps appearing in these, and the show was incredibly well received. It won a bunch of awards and there was hope of a potential Broadway transfer, but it really struggled post 9/11, likely due to the scapegoating narrative and also all of the death and the murder. So it closed on December 2nd, 2001. It entered regional licensing in 2002, but at the same time the creatives continued to work on it, making some significant changes, most notably in switching out some songs for its run in the West End from September 8th, 2004 to January 15th, 2005. Devon May would reprise his role as the Batboy. The production was a lot less favorably reviewed and closed a month earlier than expected. The West End changes were not implemented regionally until the 2014 production at Harvard. It's unclear to me whether they switched out all the licensed options to the new script or not. It's never quite clear to me how licensing works when they update a script that already exists, because they have to have so many scripts printed that are already in circulation, and like, do you just like throw out all of that material and give it all new material? I don't know, and nobody can answer that question no matter how many times I ask it. Either way, there have also been developmental readings in the past 10 years continuing to work on this show and tweaking it, with some implications of like hope to one day make it to Broadway. So it is likely that the changes in the current City Center production are even more different from what the regional changes were, which I was not able to get my hands on. So there is a middle version of Batboy that I cannot analyze here for you guys that does exist. So I'm acknowledging that. I'm sorry I couldn't get my hands on it. But let's dive into the plot. The show opens in rural West Virginia on a very dark cave where we see three teens, Rick, Ron, and Ruthie, exploring the cave. Specifically in this moment, they are stopping to smoke weed and have a snack, but generally they're on an explore. And while they're down there, they run into what they presume is the cave monster, but then realize it's like this Batboy hybrid creature. They try to interact with him. One of them like tries to give him a Frito or something, but then he attacks and bites Ruthie, so Ron and Rick pin him to the ground. We then pause for the opening song titled Hold Me Batboy, where the cast sings about this creature in like an almost religiously reverent way. He's being held up as this pariah who was cast out and treated like dirt, but was important and here to teach us something, and he won't be there for us now. More or less. There's also some dialogue breaks within the song where Ruthie is hospitalized and the Batboy is turned over to the sheriff, and then the sheriff takes him over to Dr. Parker, who's the local veterinarian, to ask what to do with the creature, and a suggestion is brought up to euthanize him, but some of the townspeople wonder if he can be trained to be useful instead. And by the time the sheriff arrives at the Parker house, he feels like killing the boy is probably not the right Christian thing to do, and the teenage daughter, Shelley, is incredibly fascinated by him in a sort of whoa, he's so ugly and gross, can we keep him kind of way. Meanwhile, her mother, Meredith, is trying to get her to be more kind to this boy, taking him under her wing in a very motherly way. The sheriff just wants them to deal with it because he's up for re-election soon and he wants it to look like he knows how to handle situations. And then they put the boy in one of the cages Dr. Parker has lying around. I don't know why he has one that is this large lying around his house, but good for him. And the Batboy shrieks a lot, which Shelley finds overwhelming, but she tries to talk to him, and then they decide to name him. Shelley wants to name him Ugly, and Meredith decides to call him Edgar. And then she goes off and tries to figure out what he's going to eat. And while he's gone, Shelley's boyfriend Rick comes over and sings a song called What You Want to Do, where he basically taunts the boy and is like, we're gonna torture you and humiliate you and do bad things to you before we kill you, LOL. Until Shelley keeps calling for help, and then Meredith runs in and kicks Rick out of the house. Shelley, crying, goes off to bed, and Meredith sings a song about how she's going to help find a home for the poor Batboy, a place where he's accepted and loved and cared for, and he sings along. To some degree. The next scene is a town council meeting where they point out that the slaughterhouse is empty because the cows that are alive are too skinny to kill, and also all the cows keep dying of some mysterious plague and it's kind of a problem. And somebody suggests that perhaps maybe it's because the recently contained Batboy has been drinking their blood and that's what's making them sick. When Dr. Parker gets home, he meets the boy and is about to give him a lethal injection, but Meredith stops him and suggests that they try to save him and take care of him. And Dr. Parker is like, the ranchers are already blaming all their problems on him and they already kind of hate me for not being able to save all their cows, so this is kind of the best thing to do, otherwise they're kind of gonna have my head. And she's like, no, but please save him. He's just a little guy. And Dr. Parker gets really frustrated at her for suddenly having all of this love in her heart because she doesn't seem to love him anymore. And basically they agree that he will keep the Batboy alive if she tells him that she loves him, and they go off and have sexy times together for the first time in a while. Also, we discover that the Batboy needs to drink blood to survive. This is not shocking. Cut to the hospital room where Mrs. Taylor, mother of Rick, Ron, and Ruthie, sings to Ruthie about how everything's going to be fine, but also for some reason nobody's killed the Batboy, which she finds deeply upsetting because she wants to protect her babies. The doctor says, I don't understand why her blood isn't clotting, but other than that, she's doing just fine. She's gonna be fine. Which led me on quite a logistical rabbit hole, despite this not at all dramaturgically mattering, but I'm gonna tell you about it because I know about it, so now you have to. What I learned is that some venom after certain animal bites, most commonly snakes, can prevent the clotting of blood. This is called coagulopathy, so that is a thing that is possible. Long-term coagulopathy, like a blood disorder, is treated via transfusions, but in the case of an animal bite, as long as the initial bite isn't in a bad spot where a person might bleed to death, the the anticoagulant in the animal's saliva usually wears off after just a couple hours, so they should be fine. The bigger concern, of course, is diseases and infection from the wound. I do think that her wound not healing at all and the anticoagulant not wearing off at all by this point is definitely odd, but also vampire bats tend to be pretty teeny tiny, and Bat Boy is just an entire almost adult man. So we're gonna happily go with some serious suspension of disbelief here. I'm allowing it. If we say that like one tiny vampire bat, like I've seen them, they're at the Bronx Zoo now, they're like this tall, right? If we're saying that their bite is wears off of like a cow in a certain area after like 3 hours, I would imagine that this times whatever a human person is would probably take a couple of days. Anyway, cut back to the Parker home where Edgar is now in people clothes and is trying to teach him how to speak, which becomes a song teaching him all kinds of things like traditional etiquette and emotional regulation and animals and reading and fun facts, and him soaking all of it up like a sponge. He passes his high school equivalency exam. There's a whole dance break with the entire family. Just an entire kick line. It's very impressive. It's a really great time. At the next town council meeting, they discuss plans for the religious revival happening that weekend, and there is a formal request to Dr. Parker that Edgar not attend because the locals feel uncomfortable about him, and more false accusations are brought forward, and so he promises to tell his family that Edgar will not be attending. Back home, they get ready to go out of town for the weekend and miss the revival, but Edgar, who now has a British accent because of how many BBC language tapes he's been listening to, asks if he can go, given that he just finished reading the Bible again, and it would mean a lot to him to be able to go. And he gets very upset when he learns that he's been asked not to attend because he knows that he's not here to harm anybody and simply wants to be part of the community. But he then has a small lapse of judgment and starts to attack Dr. Parker because he's so hungry and he's not sure what happened there, but he's able to stop it. And Meredith wonders if Edgar is okay, entirely ignoring her husband who has just been attacked, so that he gets really angry at her for not actually loving him. And she talks about how they will bring Edgar to the revival anyway so that he can prove that he's not that bad to the people of the town and it's actually going to go just fine. Parker talks to Edgar about how hungry he is, to which Edgar is unsure what to do because he knows that it is wrong to consume the blood of another and to like kill. And Dr. Parker offers him a live rabbit as a way to like test himself, and he's horrified, but it keeps the boy distracted while Dr. Parker gets ready to euthanize him. But then the voices in his head tell him it's better if he just does stuff that will make his wife want to admit that she's wrong and get rid of the boy instead. So he decides to fuel everybody's fears about the boy, starting by euthanizing Ruthie and intending to blame it on Edgar. After intermission, we open on the revival, led by the extremely charismatic and unbelievably talented every single time Reverend. When he asks who wants to be healed, Edgar steps forward saying he wants to be healed. There's this whole piece near when he's singing to the rabbit at the end of Act 1, where he's like praying to God to change him, to make him different, because that's all that he really wants. He just wants to like be normal. And he knows that's not possible. So he's kind of is wondering if, you know, if I can be healed, maybe I will be normal, is kind of the subtext of what he wants and why he's trying to do this. And the congregation, of course, starts whispering about how he wasn't supposed to be there and how dare he show up. But the Reverend brings him forward and he sings about how he knows the whole community hates him, but he feels like it's because they don't know him and all he wants to do is walk among them and do all the things that they get to do without worry or fear. It's very sweet, it's very heartfelt, and the community is like, you know what? Yeah, sure, let's accept you. And it's great, and it's a good time, and he's accepted into their community. But then a drunk Dr. Parker appears and informs them that he discovered that Ruthie had died of an infection caused by Edgar's bite, and that he is dangerous and deadly to both people and cows. And the community immediately turns on Bat Boy, blaming him for causing the cow plague. Dr. Parker assures them that he has called the Institute to come take the boy off their hands and tries to reconcile and reconnect with his wife, who is overwhelmed and very angry at the situation. Poor Edgar is just in pieces. He's saying he didn't mean to hurt anybody, and Meredith tries to calm him down and tell everybody that he's civilized now, he's no longer a danger, but nobody really cares to hear it. Rick gets incredibly angry and again begins to threaten Edgar, waving around a gun, which Shelley steps in front of to try to save him, and Rick shoves her. And Edgar gets very angry at this, so he attacks and bites Rick and then runs off. Shelley and Meredith also run off as well, and Dr. Parker is asked to save Rick, and he gives the boy a lethal injection and says, "Oh, there's nothing I can do. It's just too late." At which point everybody vows to find and take down the Bat Boy because he is now responsible supposedly for the death of two of this one woman's children. Away from the chaos, Meredith and Shelley talk about how the three of them are going to run away with Edgar, away from this crazy town, and make a new life together. And at the end of this song, Shelley tells her mother that she is in love with Edgar and she wants to marry him, to which her mother is horrified, and Shelley is so angry that she runs off into the woods where she finds Edgar. And they hold hands, and it's cute, and then the god Pan appears and sings to them, along with all of the other animals via large animal orgy. Some sentences have never been said before, and that's beautiful, about how they should express their love for one another in a particular way. While that's going on, Ron, the last of the living Taylor siblings, is elsewhere. He's trying to find where he can find Batboy to take him down because the whole village is like after him. And he realizes that Edgar likes blood, so he figures he could probably find him at the slaughterhouse. Now, unfortunately, some of the other adults figure the same thing, and so when they hear commotion made by Ron inside of the slaughterhouse, they set it on fire. Specifically, it is Mrs. Taylor, the mother of her now 3 dead children, who does that. Ron does escape, but he is greatly singed, and Dr. Parker enters to try to save, aka kill him, but then he goes, oh no, he's just dead, so yeah. He then says more things to try to build up the energy of this mob, but accidentally goes, everyone will pay, I shall kill again, in his little speech, and everybody's like, oh my gosh, what did you just say? And he realizes that he almost gave himself up, and he's like, that's what Edgar would say! And then the mob continues to try to track down Batboy. In the forest, Shelley and Edgar are semi-clothed and cuddling all by themselves. He mentions that he is hungry. She offers her arm as something that he can feed on because she's not afraid of him and she wants to be a part of him. And he reluctantly accepts, but before he can bite her, Meredith shows up and is horrified and talks about this being an abomination. And Shelley starts defending Edgar, and Meredith is like, no, I won't have this. And so both Edgar and Shelley assume that she is just pretending to love Edgar, but doesn't actually really see him as an equal. So he gets ready to attack and kill her to protect their love, but then she reveals that she is Edgar's mother. And this is the moment that seeing this show live was beautiful, because I got to witness the entire auditorium process this in real time. It was great. In absolute horror, he runs off. We next see him in the mouth of the cave holding a severed cow head and singing an apology to it for killing it, but also he is hungry, and at this point he might as well just be what everybody thinks he is and just let himself be a monster. And then basically everybody finds him there, and he reveals that Dr. Parker is his father, and everybody's like, what's going on? And so Meredith and Parker tell the story of how Edgar came to be. Basically, the two of them worked in a lab together. They were kind of into each other, but decided that they were going to wait until marriage, except Parker was researching a pheromone to increase birth yield in cattle that wasn't working, so he mixed the pheromones for like lots of different creatures just to see what would happen. And one night he accidentally spills some of it onto her, and then he completely loses his mind and functionally assaults her, but it's complicated and that is acknowledged in the script, and they changed it a bit for the City Center production to be a little more consensual seeming, which I appreciated. 10 out of 10. And then on her way home, she is attacked by a bunch of bats who also are interested in their pheromones. Parker finds her half alive and brings her home to take care of her, and then decides to marry her because she's pregnant and it's the right thing to do, even though she knew that she could never love him again. And then they decide to move to this small town to try to start over. But then, immediately after Shelley is born, she gives birth to a bat-human hybrid creature and is so horrified that she tells her husband to go and kill the child. So he takes the boy out into the woods to put him down, but he can't bring himself to kill his own creation, and so he leaves the child at the mouth of the cave and hopes that nature will take its course instead. But it seems like the bats took him in and they raised him, which is great. Good for the bats. Once the story is told, Meredith tries to say, see, he's not a problem, he's my son. And somebody's like, but he's causing the cow plague. And she's like, no, you're trying to raise cows on the side of a mountain, and she wants to reinstate their family as it's meant to be, but Edgar is so distraught about their abandonment of him at birth, saying that he's truly just a beast who destroys everything he touches and he just wants to be left alone. Dr. Parker pins Edgar to the ground, then chooses to cut a gash in his own neck, forcing the Batboy to give in to his instinct to begin feeding, after which he stabs Batboy in the back and gets ready for another stab, but Meredith tries to pull the boy off of Dr. Parker to save him, and so then she too gets stabbed, and then they all die. And then Shelley holds Edgar as he dies, and then they all sing the finale, which is a version of the opening song, this time about the lessons that we've learned, such as don't raise cows on the side of a mountain, and scapegoating is wrong, and don't deny the beast inside of you. And that's our show! Now, the obvious base level interpretation of the show, right, is that it's about general marginalization and scapegoating, specifically using the person who is different as the one to blame for all of your problems, even if they are responsible for 0 of them. And this can, of course, apply to any form of difference, but interestingly, the very limited academic discussion around the show is almost entirely from before 2004 and almost entirely exclusively about race, with the exception of a single sentence that notes homosexuality in a 2003 chapter. And this makes sense, right, given that the primary discussion of marginalization happening right after the show hit the mainstream was post 9/11 xenophobia and racism, so this was top of mind for everybody. This era just also happened to be the very beginnings of the field of disability media studies, so I do find it interesting that nothing I read brought that up in the slightest, with the exception of some more recent Reddit threads. But honestly, There were maximum 2 articles about disability in Tommy, which is way older than Batboy, and even more obviously about disability, so unfortunately this kind of does track. But either way, with this show, I find myself at an interesting crossroads where, on one hand, this is about general marginalization and should be talked about in a general sense because this is functionally a fictional creature. And on the other hand, there is so much explicitly disability-related language, reference, and aesthetic in this piece that I'm almost uncomfortable with it being generalized because that both feels like erasure and also like a way to accidentally cause harm if not handled properly. To phrase that differently, in case that didn't make sense, which it's liable to have not because I'm very tired, there is a thing that sometimes happens when working with characters and or worlds that exist outside of the realm of realism to some extent, where I can both acknowledge the logistical issues with okay, how do we physicalize this as non-human or otherwise visibly different? And also say that using disability aesthetics without acknowledgement or consciousness of disability and directly equating it to being non-human feels kind of icky, and I never quite know how to reconcile those two things, because in that case, like, what is the alternative, you know? And also, anytime this conversation is brought up, it is usually treated as an oversensitive party pooper opinion. We'll return to that in a bit because I think there is a way to hold both pieces of that concurrently. I've been thinking about this for quite some time. But first, let's jump back into the disability language, starting with the very first scene where they first meet the Batboy and their immediate response is, oh, he's just some deformed kid, and refer to him as it, and this thing, and as an animal. The animal language appears in the spoken text, I believe 5 times, though it is also in the stage directions to describe the Batboy's movements on a few occasions. The word monster in reference to the Batboy also appears 16 times, beast 11 times, and creature 3 times. The word abomination is used in reference to something else, and it's immediately assumed it's being used in reference to the Batboy. The word changeling in reference to him also appears in the opening number. We also see the use of the word ugly 3 times, 5 if you count Shelley asking her mom if they can name him ugly, and most notably the word freak appears on 20 separate occasions. Now, if you're new to the disability media studies world, hello, I'm so glad to have you. Thank you for listening. You may be wondering what these words have to do with disability, and that is because a lot of them we don't really think of as associated with disability anymore. Their meanings have expanded out beyond what they originally meant. But for disability historians, these are things that in a historical record automatically highlight as an indicator of early disability. The connection with ugly is still fairly recent history. There used to be so-called ugly laws around the United States that forbade visibly disabled people from being out in public, and if they did, it risked jailing and or institutionalization. The first ugly law appeared in 1867, and the last was not repealed until 1974. The attempted drag bans in various states function as similarly a more modern version of the ugly law, operating on the same ideas to keep visual difference out of the public eye. If we trace ugly all the way back to, say, Shakespeare times, there wasn't a huge linguistic difference between somebody being conventionally unattractive and somebody being visibly disabled. Ugly was just one of those catch-all terms for both, along with deformed and monstrous. It also used to be class differentiated, so if you were a higher class but unattractive, you would not be considered any of these terms. So if you're finding these things in historical texts, it might not 100% be a clue that a person was disabled, but it also very much could be, because as time went on and we saw disability start to become its own actual category, these words began to stick more onto the physical difference side than not. Going back to monster or monstrous, one of the first texts to attempt to describe congenital difference, aka birth defects, was the 1573 of Monsters and Marvels, or On Monsters and Prodigies, depending on which translation you look at, and this text combined theological ideas of disability with early medical ideas, creating a truly fascinating collection of thoughts that attempted to sort of standardize and categorize things. Both saying that difference is caused by actual medical stuff, but also perhaps God is trying to tell us things through these creatures. But in this text, he refers to monsters and marvels, or prodigies, again depending on your translation, as being something born outside of the course or completely against nature, such as a child born with a limb difference, or conjoined twins, for example. He considered disabilities and differences like blindness, deafness, and intersex conditions as maimed people, rather than monsters, marvels, or prodigies, but colloquially all would eventually end up being lumped together. These words stuck throughout history and expanded to include other dehumanizing terms like beast, creature, and animal to refer to disabled people. In fact, they would use the same language to refer to an intersex child as they would a two-headed cow, and would have their births recorded in the exact same place and same way in many places, blurring the line between human and animal because to them, and even to us in the modern day to some extent, we just phrase it a little bit differently now, disability is an aberration for what humans are supposed to be. Now, very early European freak shows, all the way back to the Middle Ages, were called monstrosities. The colloquial name would then be changed more toward the freak show, though the ideas of monsters and crosses between animals and humans and all of that would continue to be a marketing strategy for centuries. Also, the first time a group of freaks would go on strike, leading to the first performers union in the United States, would be in 1899 over their desire to be called prodigies instead of freaks. So all of these words are very much used explicitly to refer to disabled people until the freak show, as we think of it, died out in the early to mid 1900s. But even then, one of the next iterations of the freak show was the horror film genre, which heavily relies on monsters and freaks and the just human enough but also not human enough to be creepy, uncanny valley kinds of things to make an audience uncomfortable. I have a video called How Freak Shows Built Broadway that covers this history. I will link that above. I also have a video specifically about disability and horror that is more recent that I will also link above for you, and both will be in the description as well if you want to check them out after. I also do want to note that freak shows very much included other marginalized identities, most notably people we would now consider intersex and trans, as well as racialized people. So this language sometimes translated over to those identities as well, especially if the person was somewhere on that intersection between race and disability. All marginalization is intertwined. It always has been, particularly in the era of eugenics, where racial purity was dictated by disability status, and things perceived as disability status included race, gender, poverty, sexuality. Many of these words have historically been used for many groups at once. I am more pointing to the fact that this language is primarily disability in origin, and thus most typically associated with that group. It then generalized particularly during the eugenics period. And this does not mean that we should ignore all the other aspects of marginalization that the show reflects, just that we should be conscious of the disability implications because they are the most explicit. But anyway, I think that history covers all the disability terms used in the show with the exception of changeling. This one is also tied all the way back to earlier human history, but versions of it have lasted until today. Basically, the idea of a changeling tale is a folk tale that we see in cultures on almost every single continent as a very early explanation for disabled children, particularly those with developmental disabilities. These stories usually involve a human child who was meant to exist or existed for a period of time, but was then changed, being replaced by a demon, fairy, or other supernatural being with that child of their own. We often see changeling tales primarily reflecting developmental disability. The kind of difference is less like, he doesn't have an arm, and more like, something is different about this child, but we can't quite put our finger on it. But it would occasionally be used to describe more visible disabilities as well. Changelings and intersex children also have a bit of a history, but that is a lot less documented. Not that changeling tales are super well documented in the first place. That's a rabbit hole I had to go down once. It was a bad time. But anyway, in the modern day, we often see stories about autism or disabilities taking their child away that are functionally modern changeling tales, if that helps you to conceptualize a little bit better. There's also explicit disability subtext in the idea of wanting and trying to kill a deformed baby right after birth. That narrative is often attributed to the stories in ancient Rome of mass disabled infanticide, despite our best guess from the historical record being that mercy killing was no more common than it is today. It is unfortunately still very common today, but there was no pits of babies in ancient Rome, as lots of literature makes you think. That was primarily promoted by eugenicists to encourage eugenics practices in the early 20th century, but I digress. There is some truth to the fact that throughout all of human history, it has often been believed that it is better to live no life at all than to live a disabled one, and so to some extent there have always been people who have felt like it is their duty to put disabled children out of their misery, often in the first couple years of life. And historically, it was often through exposure, which is like swaddling a baby and leaving them somewhere in the woods, but just as often someone would pick the baby up and take it in after the fact. They were saved very often. We also know that sometimes parents would do things to their changeling baby to try to break the devils free or get the fairies to bring back their original child, things that would often hurt or even kill a child. That is also a thing that has happened and still happens today. Exorcisms are a really great example of that. But anyway, the link between infanticide or otherwise abandonment and disability is a very strong one, and one that you're probably used to seeing in media. The Hunchback of Notre Dame is a really great example of that off the top of my head, but it does appear in many other places as well. The other disability subtext things that I picked out were the threats to send him to the Institute in the second act. It's unclear what kind of institute this is. It could be just as well a zoological facility, but the idea of sending somebody off to an institute obviously has some serious implications of institutionalization. But returning to the idea of freak shows and of there being a thin line between somebody being a monster or beast and then being a human person, this is a common thread that freak shows use to get people interested enough to pay to come view the freaks. What a curiosity it is to see people who are not quite people, and how that makes you feel uneasy or unsure about what constitutes a human being. Or, alternatively, makes you feel better because maybe you don't feel like you fit in, but at least you fit in better than that creature does. Freak shows also often use social Darwinism, which is basically the idea that human evolution is happening all at the same time, and you're more evolved than these creatures. How lucky you are to be in the superior, more evolved version of the human race, because these poor, uncivilized freaks want nothing more than to just be like you, and that's what they dream of, which, going back to Bad Boy, we see a lot of these same ideas manifested in a slightly more modern way, where he's learning all of these new skills because he wants to fit in, he wants to feel complete, and at one point he sings a line saying, "Please won't you change the way I am or prove I'm human underneath." And the more he's able to assimilate with this group of people, he is separated from beasthood, with his mother saying he's not the same wild creature you brought to my home, and you're not a beast. Could a beast speak as eloquently as you? Does a beast have a soul? But then the final line of the show sort of flips this in the opposite direction, saying, don't deny your beast inside. So rather than a freak show sort of, hey, this is interesting, come look at this person who is different, the narrative sort of works in both directions to muddy that line while simultaneously showing you the negative outcomes of scapegoating and of othering people. And also there's some stuff in the middle of that about interspecies sex not actually being that bad, which is honestly commentary itself about perhaps them not actually being different species, because this is a thing that is possible, even though they kind of are, and also their siblings. But some of the stuff does give undertones, like to a historian's perspective, of discussions of interracial marriage, so that is a thing. The disability subtext of the show also expands out beyond the script into how it is clearly inspired by, or perhaps accidentally parallels, other disability shows. The image of a person who is different going to a religious place and asking to be healed is one that reminded me a lot of Violet, which we've covered in this series before. Violet was off-Broadway in 1997, the same year that Bat Boy opened in LA, so I doubt there's a direct correlation there, though the short film of Violet was out much, much earlier, and a lot of people saw it growing up, so it could have impacted this. That just immediately sprung to mind for me when I was watching this. The we're all freaks depending on how you look at it messaging is very similar to what Sideshow did, which also opened in 1997, so likely didn't directly impact the show, but that show quickly gained a cult following after it closed, so there is a world where some of the ideas seeped into this somewhere along the way. There are also many elements of The Elephant Man in here, which I have not covered yet. They're making a new film adaptation that will probably be out in the next couple of years, so I'm holding for that. But that is also a thing. I won't go too in depth into it because I don't think I'm qualified to talk about it in this moment. Scott Miller's 2003 chapter on Bat Boy talks about the origins of this character in other horror creatures, such as Frankenstein's monster, of course, and how Edgar is also a scientific creation and the creator of the monster is unable to kill it. The fact that his twin sister's name is Shelley is not lost on me. There is no world where that parallel was not deliberate. Frankenstein also on my analysis list, probably next October. But a lot of what we see and how this character is created is a combination between different characters, and then he becomes educated and wants to join society but cannot because others fear his difference, and so eventually he becomes somewhat vindictive and angry, is functionally the base plot of Frankenstein. There's a conversation to be had about the voices in Dr. Parker's head and the connection to Jekyll and Hyde. I'm choosing to omit that entirely. That's a complicated conversation. I didn't really think needs to be included in here at this time, especially because in the original staging, I did not realize that hearing voices was the artistic intent until reading the script, and I still did not pick it up in the City Center production, so that is what it is. Miller's chapter also connected Edgar to Dracula with how he stokes Christian anxieties and how he's both pathetic at times and dangerous at others, and also obviously the vampire bat thing. Yeah, but the connection that was somehow not mentioned in the chapter that is so blatant to me, and thus why I made a comparing to media section in the first place in this video, is how clearly inspired by Tommy the show is to some extent. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, I will link my Tommy video above for you, but basically it is a rock opera by The Who that was written in the 60s but on Broadway in the 90s about a boy named Tommy who develops catatonia, and they assume he is, to quote the show, deaf, dumb, and blind, and then he becomes incredible at pinball, he breaks free from his catatonia, he gets treated functionally like a god, and then when he does something his followers disagree with, they all throw him to the sidelines. And then they sing about all the things that they learned from him. Kind of. It's as difficult a plot to explain as Bat Boy is, but in both shows we have the way the titular character is different and how they are treated as a messiah because of it. In this case, Bat Boy's opening song, Bring Him to the Light, Won't You Love Him, Won't You Save Him, and You Are Here Not to Laugh But to Learn, indicating that he is more of a religious idol here to teach us a lesson rather than a true story of something that happened. And the line near the end, yet in his previous hours on earth he taught us all, like it is his sacrifice that had to be made to teach all of us a lesson. In Tommy's case, well, just the entirety of Act 2 really, but also in Act 1 there is concern that he will be unable to be saved because he does not know who Jesus is. A running theme in Tommy is him singing See Me, Feel Me, Touch Me, Heal Me, and in Bat Boy it's everybody else saying to the Bat Boy, hold me, love me, touch me, save me, which, if that's not a deliberate parallel, I'm almost angry. Miller's article also noted that Bat Boy is born a kind of virgin birth. He is the victim of profound prosecution, false charges, insults, abuse, and a kind of metaphorical crucifixion. He lives a life of tolerance and tries to spread that message. So the Christ parallels are very strong here. Edgar also has a piece where he says, I submit that any twist, if he has eyes to see, can seize his fate, self-educate, and turn out just like me, and living by the rules I could learn if you teach me the tools. I know I'm strange, so help me change, please. Which is very similar messaging to Tommy's lines and how he answers Sally Simpson's questions around how all he wanted his entire life was just to be like everybody else. Now, Tommy is also the first rock opera and one of the more famous rock musicals to exist for that reason, becoming famous as a stage production 4 years before Bat Boy opened in LA. It also got its start at La Jolla Playhouse beforehand, so it was on that coast. So of course the show is going to feel inspired by this in some way. And I would again be incredibly surprised, if not a little bit upset, if it wasn't directly influenced by it to some extent. But there are specific musical moments that I feel directly point to it. And perhaps that's just the combination of rock music and a British white boy with atypical physicality, but at the very least least, the song What You Want to Do is incredibly Cousin Kevin coded, and much of the level of campy, strange plot stuff going on in the show is similar to that of Tommy's, just presented a lot differently. And that may be more of a rock musical thing than a deliberate parallel, but also, even if these parallels weren't super deliberate, it is important cultural context that I, as a viewer, and likely other people as viewers, especially because the current City Center production is happening now and Tommy was on Broadway very recently, are going to connect it to. And while that show is less explicit about the nature of Tommy's actual correct disability, it is also just as explicit with some of the same disability language we see in this show, which strengthens the disability view of this character and the parallel between the two of them. And to be clear, in both Tommy and Bad Boy, I do take serious issue with the idea of turning the disabled character into like a life lesson to be learned or a metaphor for something larger. I think it's less egregious here because of the overall tone that it takes it less seriously and he feels less human than Tommy does. And also the specific Messiah, let's learn a lesson from this guy messaging is much smaller. Like, it's really only concretely in a few lines versus the entirety of Tommy's second act being centered around building him up as a Messiah and then tearing him down. But I want to still acknowledge that as a small critique of the text itself, I also just think dramaturgically it feels a little out of place when it does appear in both the opening and closing songs, but that sort of works in its favor of being an issue because it doesn't stick out to people in comparison to the everything else that is going on in the show. There's a lot of things happening, it's kind of hard to internalize small pieces of it. But the thing that has most stuck with me about disability in Bad Boy is the use of disability aesthetic, of the visuals we associate with disability in traditional embodiments of Edgar's character. By which I guess I kind of just mean how Devin May portrayed the character because he's the only non-photograph version of the character that I saw of this before the City Center production. Though a lot of these things are in the stage directions and based on photographs seem to appear in other versions, which is that the original, before he's taught how to be a human version of the character, has very similar physicality to what we are used to when we are seeing somebody aping a disabled person, typically a developmentally disabled person in media. He holds his hands in a T-Rex position, he flaps them around, he's constantly moving his head around and scanning his surroundings, his mouth is usually open, and he screams and makes a lot of guttural noises. He also mimics the behavior and speech of other people, and when he's learning his first words and sort of parroting things, it technically sounds like a toddler learning to speak and messing up while he works his way to clearer language, but because it is a full-grown man doing these things, it comes across differently. In maybe a not so great way sometimes. Also, the fact that we are watching this character functionally learn how to somewhat robotically mask all of these traits, but then when really overwhelmed with either positive or negative emotions, falls back into the more feral way of being, for lack of a better word. And this is where I find myself a bit conflicted because obviously, this is just a human person behaving the way a bat in a body of a human person would, or a human raised by bats would behave. This is the logical physicality choice that you would go for, and it's not necessarily their fault that, like, just in general, an adult pretending to behave like a child is going to look like a developmentally disabled adult. That's just kind of a pitfall that we have when we see those kinds of things. So like suspension of disbelief, this is an actor pretending to be a non-human, Sydney, get over it, right? But on the flip side, something about it feels uncomfortable to me, especially when we see him in regular human clothes. I follow the through line, I follow the vision, all the things that the style is a combination and or derivative of are things that I've personally studied. But then when I was studying them and I was watching my classmates make physicality choices that directly reflected how people mock disabled people, I both understood pedagogically why they needed to play with that kind of physicality and felt incredibly unsafe and ridiculed in those spaces. But even to some extent, I didn't understand pedagogically why it was necessary because there were many times where we were explicitly told to functionally try on different disabilities temporarily to see what we could learn from these things. That also felt incredibly alienating. And I've been, helping to push for alternatives of this in arts curriculums in the past. And I also want to acknowledge that the majority of the things mentioned as the basis of the style has direct or indirect links to mental and developmental disability. We have covered how Commedia dell'arte and early clown find their roots in court fools aping the behavior of so-called natural fools who were kept functionally as pets. Many elements of vaudeville sideshows and freak shows were the same, just marketed slightly differently. Again, that's in the video that I linked. And a lot of experimental theater in the early to mid 1900s was inspired by madhouse performance, i.e. theater practitioners would go to institutions, they would watch the shows put on for the community, and they would take inspiration for it. Dadaism is explicitly based off of this, just off the top of my head, and German Expressionism is adjacently based off of this. And of course, much of what followed these things is to some degree inspired by the movements before, so we see mental disabilities seeping into all of these different kind of movements, right? And I would also not be surprised if some elements of traditional gay campiness and performance intertwine with this somehow, given that queer identities were categorized as disability until they still kind of are. We just go about it differently. That's a conversation for another day. But acknowledging all of this baggage, for lack of a better word, on this kind of theater and performance makes a neutral opinion of, well, he's just pretending to be a boy who's a bat. Chill out. Feel a little bit less neutral and more like it's kind of ignoring some subtext that is there. And because the show has so much explicit disability language and references other disability texts, it starts to feel a little bit weirder. And interestingly enough, the more civilized air quotes, this boy becomes, the more he shifts into characteristics and physicality that out of context would read as somewhere directly on the line between autistic coding and just Jim Carrey being goofy, which is an area that I feel is gray enough that it's totally fine. It's the first act stuff that is borderline alarming. But at the same time, I'm also the kind of scholar and theater maker who's heavily rooted in practicality, and so while I think academically this is a definitive problem or just like a thing that should be discussed, my next question is, what is the alternative? Because the core of the issue is that pretty much any way we try to do over-the-top physicality to diverge from humanhood, we find ourselves in accidentally aping disability territory. Unless you're going full clown, like Princess Winifred in Once Upon a Mattress, or there is a prescribed stylized physicality like is typical with Tommy, where with the exception of the children, who typically do have the disability problem in that show, the adult Tommy is practically in marionette doll territory. And so it moves away from a disability aesthetic. But neither of these things really work for this character, and I can't think of other examples where this isn't the case. And this gets even more interesting when it comes to the City Center production, given that Taylor Trench, who is playing Batboy and is impeccable casting and absolutely crushed it, is one of the original Christopher Boones in Curious Incident. He has also played Evan Hansen, both of which are developmentally disabled characters that we have spoken about on this channel. So to some extent, an audience who knows him as a performer is more likely to map disability onto whatever physicality he chooses to do. This is also the first time this show has been done for a very mainstream audience in this capacity in some time, and we are more sensitive to these things now than we were the last time New York audiences saw the show, so reactions to it are bound to be a lot different than they were in the early 2000s. Now, I'm not sure what particular solution I have to offer here, beyond like making it more deliberate and stylized, and perhaps like taking some of the traits of the character that are typically expressed one way physically and trying to express them in a different way that feels a little bit less like playground mockery. I will talk more about this production in a hot second. City Center sort of did this. It was significantly better. Quite honestly, can't off the top of my head imagine what that entirely looks like to make that entire shift, which I think just requires a little bit more imagination. I think there's a world where a very dedicated dramaturg could like befriend a bat scientist and find a way to better specify the physio and social norms of bathood and how they behave differently when placed in human captivity, as well as do some reading on various cases of like children who are raised in the woods and what their behavior was like upon attempted integration into human life, because there's a couple case studies like that. And like that would give us more options as to what pieces of him are physically one species versus another species, which would help us to differentiate what behaviors and physicalities would logically carry over and how to go about that, in which case it would probably come across as much more differentiated and stylized. I think like there are some traits that carry over between like developmental disability and being a bat, like sensory issues, but is there a bat researched way to express this idea instead? And if yes, would that read to an audience, or at least the subsection of the audience to whom this probably matters the most? And that is the thing that I've been pondering, and I will continue to do so because I don't have answers. I also don't know a lot about bat behavior, so that doesn't help. Now, to pull the curtain back on my process for a hot minute, I did write the entire rest of the script in August, both for scheduling reasons because I had to take all of October off, but also so certain people had early access to this content, and I did not see the show until last night as the day of filming, 4 days ago as of the time this video is coming out. So do forgive me if I've forgotten little things here and there. I was not able to see the show with my script out in front of me to track every single change, nor do I have the original staging memorized to compare it as concretely as my little perfectionist academic heart would like, but we're gonna do our best. Here's a clip of Bows for a hot second so you can see what my view of this show looked like. It was great. My seat was $28. You should join it's like for people under 40 at New York City Center, and you get $28 tickets. Go do that. Anyway, as expected, lots of changes were made for this production. They cut a couple songs, including Ugly Boy, What You Want to Do, Dance With Me Darling, Another Dead Cow, Mrs. Taylor's Lullaby, and they kept the London swap out of Inside Your Heart for Mine All Mine, which I feel is the stronger song and scene. The overall goal of the changes, as best I understand from the inside of the playbill, is to sort of clean it up and ground it a little bit more so it feels more like it starts in a grounded place and then devolves into chaos rather than just being straight chaos the whole way through, calming down some of the camp of it a little bit. And I feel like narratively and tonally that was successful, but also dramaturgically it left more holes, which required more suspension of disbelief from the audience of the circumstances than the original version did, and also like further muddled the messaging of the original. And I don't think the Act 1 pacing is still quite sure what it wants. Act 2 is very tight and everything has a purpose and it's just like a really great time. I feel like Act 1 kind of meanders all over the place. But that has also been the case for the show's entire lifespan. I think it is tighter now, but it still is struggling with pacing. I loved that Shelley had more agency in this. It does make her feel a little bit older, which has both its positives and its negatives. Positive being she's more interesting, she's more in charge of things, it's more like I enjoy the character more, but it's negative because there was like this childlike innocence to her that I think is a bit lost in this version. Not just with her character, but with all of the kids. Rick, Ron, and Ruthie in the original production are like, oh, it's a little guy, and anything offensive they say towards him is sort of innocently intentioned and they don't realize, and then it becomes hateful after he attacks Ruthie, and they're like told by the rest of the community to hate this guy, whereas in this one they're automatically unkind and hateful, and like think about how much money they can make off of him from the very moment that they meet him, and that is their primary motivation until all of them die. The playbill talks about how they wanted to expand the town to be real people rather than just like a faceless mob, which I think was successful in some ways and made the show more muddled and complicated in others. I think the focus on vengeance from the townsfolk is the cleaner choice because you can add a tinge of something else underneath that as well. I just don't think that we have the runtime to hold all of these different motivations of everything concurrently, because there's already just so much going on plot-wise that keeping the smaller characters in a more like operetta style archetype is probably a better move just for cleanliness of narrative. I didn't feel like the original version showed the Hope Falls people as that faceless or inhumane. They felt fleshed out to me, so adding on top of that here felt like there was a little bit too much going on at once, at least for me. The opening scene / number has changed significantly. I like the choice to open on Shelley giving us the opening narration of the story. It's very like Sweeney Todd, very Floyd Collins. I think it makes more sense to have her do it than just like a random other character, which is what the previous iteration was. It also used to happen after a scene, and now it opens the show, which I think it gives the show better momentum, and the cave scene always felt really long to me, so it works out a lot better. I kind of feel indifferent about the lyrical changes in the song, but I will say that a lot of the disability language that we've talked about in this analysis, like mentions of changelings and demons and whatnot, as well as descriptions of how he was mistreated and scapegoated, have been kind of removed. I think to some extent this does differentiate us from some very late 90s language describing creatures, which updates the material, which I'm not opposed to, but I also selfishly think that the inclusion of all of that language really distinguishes the underlying freakishness with which they view him, which frames the story better. Also, the show takes place in the 90s, so I think keeping the 90s language is actually a great move and helps give it that feel that it should have. Same with the song Ugly Boy, which was cut. I sort of missed that framing that it had in that song. I think the idea that I'm sort of dancing around with here is my biggest critique of this new iteration is that we talked a lot in this analysis about how the show frames the character as somebody who is very different and uses deliberate language in a way that indicates disability and many other minority identities, which helps better frame the scapegoating narrative because we are primed to look for it with the language that's being used. But the changes in the show took out a lot of that language in some very key places, which made it harder to see the core message, I guess, of what the piece is trying to be. So it feels like a tighter show to an audience, but it does not feel like a cleaner show, if that makes sense. And I might be coming at that from a bit of a bias where like, this is what I pay attention to, this is what my job is, so of course I'm going to miss it. But after seeing the show, I did some polling of not me people, and it seems like there was less clarity on what it was supposed to be about or what was going on in comparison to digital conversations I have found around the original productions. So I do feel like this feeling is expanding beyond me to other audience members. The other scapegoat narrative piece is they changed the cow bit entirely. In this one, the town is trying to transition to being a cattle town, and so they have acquired a singular cow named Gertie who is pregnant with twins, and they are praying that she can help them get the town on its feet because the coal mines are running out of coal, which means that when Edgar kills the cow at the end, it's the only cow. I loved that aspect of the narrative change. I think it added higher stakes to the meaning of that moment because he's basically destroying the only hope that the town has. That being said, I think that gag could have been kept while also keeping the all our cows keep dying and we don't know why, let's blame the bad boy narrative, which to me feels like a very crucial piece of what makes this story work as a message about difference and what we do to people who are different. And it made the cow thing just feel like a weird extra side plot line shoved in there rather than something intrinsically tied to the story around Bat Boy himself, which I think also became part of the ultimate pacing issue, especially in Act 1. I do feel like I'm being really negative here. I'm really sorry. I promise I enjoyed the show. We're gonna get to what I loved about it after the critique is done. I have lots of thoughts on all the changes. What else did I say? Oh, the other change that I didn't think was very strong, but it also seems like this is the general consensus, is that this new song, Deer in the Headlights, never quite found its footing. In the song, Shelley teaches Edgar to dance, and then Rick and siblings just kind of waltz in the front door and say, we're gonna put the freak in the bag because they can get a lot of money from selling him to the Institute. Again, there's just not a lot of dramaturgical certainty as to what the Institute is and or means. It could be anything from a mental asylum to Ripley's Believe It or Not freak show to actual medical research establishment or a zoo. Incredibly unclear. There is mention in this production from the mother where she says, the Institute, that place is a freak show, which honestly gives me even more question. I don't need the script to specify what it is. I just get more of a vibe that nobody's actually sure what it actually is, and so it feels inconsistent throughout the script, and I would like it to be consistent. I don't need to know what it is, I just need it to be consistent. Anyway, Deer in the Headlights. There is a moment in the song where we discover that Ruthie is not actually that hurt from Batboy's bite and is basically faking it, specifying she's hurt enough to collect disability checks and plenty of prescription pain meds. Very baseline, this furthers the overall siblings' desire to be rich at any cost. I followed this thought process of the line being there. I think a joke about abusing disability benefits and faking pain to get extra medication in the year 2025 probably isn't the move, partially because that's not how either of those things actually work, but also because it's at best not funny and at worst actively harmful rhetoric that I feel like we should sort of know better by now, and I was a little disappointed that that was there. I think dramaturgically, switching Ruthie's injury from a neck bite to a leg bite makes the eventual murder feel incredibly out of left field, and also like something a coroner would immediately realize was a lie on Dr. Parker's part, so he's living on borrowed time until they realize a murder happened. And I think the stakes of her actually being in the hospital with them, unsure what's going to happen to her, was a stronger narrative choice. Also, it's really funny for the doctor to be like, yeah, her neck isn't clotted, but like, it's fine. She's gonna be fine. I found that hilarious and I'm sad that it's gone. But also because Batboy comes at everybody else's neck for blood pretty much the entire show, with the exception of the Ruthie bite, which makes later attacks feel more violent and deliberate rather than just like a thing he has to do to get a snack. But all of that being said, things that I loved. Seeing the show live was an incredibly electric experience. I had the most fun. Hearing the audience process the incest reveal was a real highlight. Every single performance was so high energy and so committed to the bit, and it was just a delight. Everybody's so talented. I really love the subtle nods to the original staging while also being something completely new and different. The physical comedy that was exactly the level of crazy it needed to be, which is impressive in general, but especially because City Center productions only have like 10 days of rehearsal to pull the whole thing off. It was really strong. The audience absolutely ate it up and I had a fantastic time. It's a very strong show. It will continue to be a really strong show, and that is part of why my critiques are so specific, because like if it weren't a fantastic piece at its baseline, I wouldn't have a lot to say about how to make it stronger. I would just go, well, that's a problem. I also expected it to be like a lot less excessively staged because this show is very loud and very flashy, and it was a lot less spinny and flashy and stroby than I expected, so I consider that to be a win. But also, it's New York City Center and I was sitting really far away, so that might have been part of it. Anyway, regarding the question of disabled physicality, I and my disabled friends definitely read significant disability onto the physicality choices that were made by Taylor Trench. I did feel like it was more earnest, is the right word? I think that's the word we're gonna go for. In this production that I remember feeling when I was watching the original. It felt a lot more to me as a viewer like each physicality piece had a cause or a logic behind it from Batboy's brain, which gave it more of a relatable disability feel, but also made it feel easier to sit through, for lack of a better way to put that. Now, I do realize that I am in a sort of echo chamber because most of my friends who have seen it are disabled. I did tell them all very little about the show beforehand so I could gauge their authentic thoughts and reactions, but I couldn't talk to a lot of people between seeing the show and getting this video out to you all, but it seems generally from discussions that I have been listening to that disabled people are really seeing visible manifestations of disability, as are people who have disabled siblings, like the stims, the groans, the rocking back and forth, stuff like that, and people not as attuned to either personal lived experience or that of a family member are just seeing it as bad, which is great. It's also interesting given the fact that people see and process disability and then immediately discard that aspect of that information. That's a documented phenomenon. So there's a world where those people did think that it was disability and then forgot that they did. Again, I don't think there's that much harm being done by the visual narrative, especially in this version where it feels a bit more conscious and deliberate, but I still think there's some tweaking that could be done in the future. And maybe that's just because I want to in-depth research bat behavior and brain development and figure out what the actual behavioral and cognitive profile of a theatrical Batboy might look like to create a little more plausible deniability with his characterization. Or maybe I just think it's a better balance to be struck between making disabled audience members feel even less like it's a slight aping of certain traits and more like it's just an overwhelmed little guy they relate to. Who's to say? Now, overall, wrapping this up, if we're going to have a rock musical handling disability, I do want it to be this one. I find rock musicals often try to talk about things like marginalized identity and don't know what they're doing with it, and thus make some really sketchy storytelling choices, and this one doesn't really do that. It makes really weird storytelling choices, but it doesn't make sketchy ones, and that is definitely preferable in my book. I think it taking itself a little bit less seriously with all of this makes anything that could potentially be an issue, bar the one line in Deer in the Headlights, please get rid of it, more or less non-existent because it carries very little weight. I would personally rather play Tommy than play Batboy for a number of reasons, but from a scholar perspective, I do think that Batboy is better for the arts ecosystem, though both are notorious, again, for how loud and strobe heavy and thus inaccessibly designed they tend to be, but that's just the case for rock musicals. I, of course, am going to say that I think it would be interesting to have a disabled person in the role of Batboy. I did find a brief article about the Long Beach Playhouse having a man without hands play Edgar at one point. It didn't really tell me much about how that changed the experience of the show. It was not a helpful article, but I found a picture. But I think making the connection more explicit would actually be really great in this particular setting because it would play into the freak show element that already exists, but I think in a thoughtful way that would ground the text interestingly rather than throw a disabled actor into a modern freak show, if that makes any sense. I also think an visibly disabled actor taking on the role would be interesting, particularly along the lines of developmental disability, because a lot of the ways Edgar is treated by his family feel more like they're through that lens. Honestly, even adding any aspect of marginalized identity to the character, specifically, I would love to see a trans Batboy, because that is another like freak adjacent Frankenstein viewed identity that would be really interesting and really important here because he is usually played by a cis white man. I just want to make sure that disability is prioritized. There's also something interesting to be said about potential BIPOC casting of Batboy, of course, in that it would reflect the specific like social Darwinism intersection of disability and race often used to denote the less evolved humans from faraway lands in the freak show, which brings in more questions around assimilation and norms and at what point is he acceptable to other people as potentially a part of society. Those are things that I don't know if this show as it currently is would be quite ready to carry the weight of and added meaning of per se, but an iteration down the line might. It is definitely something to think about. And in the cases where disabled casting isn't prioritized, or even I guess when it is, I'm both very concerned and very interested in the physicality choices at hand and what the options are and what that could look like. I think it mostly worked here. I think it sort of worked in the original. I don't know how much it always works in versions of this show. I know that when I was teaching faculty about ways to change arts curriculum in the direction of universal design, I would talk about the issues of having your actors try on different disabilities or copy disability aesthetic, and I would offer some alternatives in the sense of an educational acting experience, but I acknowledge that not all things can be avoided, and that is always been like a sort of soft spot for me that I wanted to return to and think about how to like fix, because it is complicated, it is nuanced, and I'm not versed enough in what physical options exist outside of the educational space to make firm suggestions. I have clown and commedia training, but but anyway, I have rambled long enough. Do let me know what you think about that conundrum in the comments, as well as what you think of the show in general or the City Center production. Specifically, if you saw it, I believe it closes tomorrow, so you might still be able to get in and go see it if you want to. The theater is massive, so there have to be at least 3 seats open. I highly recommend the show. And as always, thank you for being here. Thank you for being. Remember, critical thinking is really sexy, and I look forward to seeing you, my dear, in the next one.